Okay, my day job is actually head of portable antiquities and treasure at the British Museum, and I'm just going to talk a little bit now about portable antiquities data and how it can be used in terms of the Norman Conquest. And it's very fortunate that Rob Webley is here because he is probably the person who has been doing the most, I would say, at the moment, although Rosie has, of course, as well, in terms of looking at 11th century material culture. So the Portable Antiquities Scheme is a scheme to record archaeological objects found by the public. I know some of you know that already, but just in case. And I looked on the database a couple of days ago, so this figure will be out of date, but we've recorded over 1.3 million archaeological objects that are found by the public, predominantly by metal detector users. That is a map of England and Wales on the left-hand side that shows you roughly where these finds are found. We have a public database that anyone can access, that you can go on and you can look at what's been found. So, for example, you can look at a photograph of the object, a description, obviously dimensions, and crucially, the find spot. People who have full access to the data, so researchers, can drill down to the actual field where an object was found, as in this case here. Now, looking at the data set as a whole, we have the kind of problem that was highlighted a little bit earlier, that 1066 is not particularly well represented in the data set. So here you see a graph of broadly all objects recorded on the Portable Antiquities Scheme database and where they are kind of based. And as you can see, there's a big explosion in objects in the Roman period, particularly Roman coins for some weird reason, and then when you get to the medieval period, you get a lot of objects as well, and the coins become less dynamic. In fact, if you look at the material culture of the 11th century on its own, this is the sort of stuff you get. So coins, quite a few, stirrup strap mounts, lots, harness fittings, quite a bit, other sort of strap fittings, quite a lot as well. In fact, we're talking about almost 5,000 finds of the 1.3 million, so a small number of objects. And here I've just taken the ones, I think, that had over 50 in each category. And as you can see, these stirrups and stirrup fittings and stirrup strap mounts seem to take over. And as you can see, generally, the ones in red are kind of horsey equipment. So much of the data for the 11th century is basically horse harness equipment. I've got a picture here, very grateful to Rob, the distribution map on the left-hand side, so you can see that there is a distribution of these finds, as you would expect, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more. And there's a very helpful drawing that was done for the Portable Antiquities Scheme some time ago that kind of shows you where these sorts of fittings come from. Now, Rob Webley's been doing a PhD on the 11th century material culture, trying to put it in its context. And again, thanks to Rob for this, but this kind of shows you another kind of problem or interesting aspect of the Portable Antiquities Scheme data. Where metal detecting is permitted in England and Wales, you get a large quantity of material culture found. In places like France, you don't find much at all because metal detecting is prohibited. And in countries like the Netherlands and parts of Belgium, where metal detecting is now being allowed, you're starting to get some sort of data. So at the moment, we're not at the point where we can make a wide comparison of this information. I'm going to move away quite quickly from the Norman Conquest to the medieval period to talk about a project that me and a colleague have been doing, exploring medieval market sites, Elias Oxen. And I wanted to do this really because it shows some of the techniques that can be applied to Portable Antiquities Scheme data that obviously Rob will be doing in some of his work, but obviously we're talking about a bigger data set and therefore allowing us to do slightly different things. So this is two maps of Portable Antiquities Scheme data, and it's kind of shown in a way where it kind of raises areas of the spatial distribution of some artifact types as a heat map. Now, what's interesting here is you can see on the left-hand side, these are markets that were believed to be in place by 1198. And then after that, there's markets that were known to be or thought to be in place because there was a charter issuing them by 1348. So one thing, of course, you can do with portable antiquity scheme data is you compare and contrast different sorts of information and spatial distributions based on what you have. Now, there are problems with the portable antiquity scheme data in terms of biases. This is the Isle of Wight, sometimes called South Island, you can see on this that there are various places where metal detecting is prohibited for lots of different reasons. It might be an urban area, it might be a national park, it might be a monument, etc. And you can see there also the kind of red dots that show you where these objects are found, and thankfully they don't kind of normally be found on the areas where metal detecting is prohibited. So that's one thing obviously to bear in mind with using portable antiquity scheme data. One thing that we did for the Medieval Markets project, which is still ongoing, is try to group object types together. Now, obviously, this is quite a rough way of looking at the data, and obviously there is some overlap, because some objects will be more than one thing. But it is quite interesting to look at the data, and of course, again, even though coins, as you'd expect, kind of dominate, there are some other major categories of objects, such as dress accessories and domestic objects, and thereafter you get kind of small categories. What's interesting about this is you can then start to compare different sites. So what we've done here is we've looked at a few areas, 6 areas, sort of at random, where we thought there was quite useful data regarding medieval market sites, and we've contrasted and compared those sites to see whether they have more in terms of any of these object categories. I'm not going to present any of the results here now, but we've got a paper coming out, hopefully in the Antiquities journal, about that next year, probably. Turning to coins, you can do some quite interesting things as well. So, I mean, obviously coins are very closely dated and they allow you to compare and contrast data quite well. So this is a comparison between the distribution, so where coins are found, of those of the late Anglo-Saxon period and those of the long cost coinage period. So it's just showing you again how you can sort of compare like with like. You can also do these sorts of graphs. So this is just looking at the late Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Norman coinage, and you could then see where there are spikes and kind of troughs, if you like, in terms of particular dating of coins. And you can see, I think it's quite interesting that you sort of get this slight rise in the late Anglo-Saxon period, and then after Norman Conquest seems to be a massive decline in coin finds, only to rise at the end of towards the end of the Anglo-Norman period. But one thing, going back to the sort of biases in portable antiquity scheme data that's quite interesting, is that obviously there are some parts of the country where there is lots of metal detecting and there are lots of objects found. And when you look at the spatial distribution, for example, of something like coin finds, you can see that East Anglia overtakes the rest of the country. In fact, Eastern England does. And you might think, well, there's lots more coin use there, isn't there? But if you look at the data in a different way, so for example, through a relative risk surface analysis, which is basically showing how common certain objects are in relation to others, you can actually see that coins aren't particularly common in East Anglia compared with other data. There's just a lot of stuff. And actually, when you look at other parts of the country, for example, the spike at the bottom of Cornwall and in some parts of the Midlands, coin finds, for whatever reason, predominate other sorts of categories of objects. Now, there's lots of reasons to explain that, and I'm not going to go into them now, but there's a couple of maps that I'll just end with that show you what you can do with particular object types. So, for example, this is spindle whorls, which you would assume are found all over the country, but for some obscure reason, spindle whorls seem to be found in massive numbers, relatively, compared with other objects, in the northwest of the country than anywhere else. And when you come to things like seal matrices, for example, there's an explosion of them, it seems, in Kent, whereas they are less common elsewhere. So again, really, this is just to introduce how the PAS data might be used. And of course, the problem we've all got with the Norman Conquest period is just that we're dealing with a very small quantity of data in relation to the whole that is out there. And that's it. Thank you.